Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Garrity.
And welcome, everyone, to the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Alexandra DeSanctis of National Review in for Jim Garrity today. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day. We have a very busy show for you today. It was a very eventful weekend, and long weekend, really, starting with Friday and the March for Life, which we'll get into a little bit later on. But so many things we could have talked about today, but we've got a very full lineup for you today, starting with, I guess we could characterize this as good in that media malpractice has been exposed on two major stories in the past 3 days. The fact that the media has been so derelict in its duty is certainly not good news. But let's go back, first of all, to Friday, because Jim and I talked at length about how serious the charges in the Buzzfeed article were if, in fact, President Trump had asked Michael Cohen to lie under oath. But we caveated that, if that can be a verb, with you got to remember it's Buzzfeed. They screwed up the dossier story. They've been a little bit suspect in some other things. And so you got to wonder if this is really true, because if you had a bombshell, would you really give it to Buzzfeed? And so that very morning, which we reminded folks, even CNN was making sure that BuzzFeed had all its ducks in a row here. Here's Allison Camerata talking to Anthony Cormier of BuzzFeed.
Have you seen any of that other corroborating evidence?
No, I've not seen it personally, but the folks that we've talked to, the two officials that we've spoken to, are fully 100% read in to that aspect of the special counsel's investigation.
Yeah, not so much. Later that night, BuzzFeed got the smackdown from the Mueller team, which issued a very rare public statement. Quote, BuzzFeed's description of specific statements to the special counsel's office and characterization of documents and testimony obtained by this office regarding Michael Cohen's congressional testimony are not accurate. Peter Carr, a spokesman for Mueller's office, said. That doesn't mean that the president's, out of the woods here, or there aren't other questions that might be a little bit suspect. But that dumped a lot of cold water on BuzzFeed, and many in the mainstream media still tried to spin it that BuzzFeed still had the story essentially right. Fast forward to, I guess it was Saturday. We're at the Lincoln Memorial. This video goes up, what looks like some high school kids giving trouble to an older American Indian as he's at an indigenous peoples rally, and he's banging his drum. But all of a sudden, we get a million different video angles showing that it was actually the Native Americans who approached the kids, and that the kids had been shouted down by other far-left activists just before that. And so it's a lot more complicated story than the media would have us explain. But they really wanted to demonize the white kids in the MAGA hats. So, Alexandra, what do you make of the media's sterling performance over the last few days?
Oh, man. Well, at least on that second story, I think the huge reveal is that even after all these other, longer videos came out, videos from other angles, the statement from one of the kids who had been there, and you could really see the full context of it. So many of the people, especially, left-leaning commentators and even journalists who had attacked the kids from the school in the first place, did not retract what they had said, did not apologize for mischaracterizing it, did not even say, well, it's more complicated than we had thought. So many of them doubled down. And I think if you're seeing that as the reaction, I think you realize that you're dealing with people who have a narrative and they're just looking at whatever's out there and kind of fitting it into what they already want to say. And I think that's true to a lesser extent maybe of the BuzzFeed story. But look at the fact the Mueller team does not, well, first of all, they don't really have an incentive to go around shutting down every story about the Russia probe or Russian collusion. They've just been kind of quietly doing their jobs for a while and ignoring the noise. So the fact that they said something, I think, is a huge deal. But on top of that, look at the fact that the Washington Post and New York Times, as much as some of the people there might want the BuzzFeed story to be true, they didn't take the story. They didn't, bank a whole story on the couple of sources who are supposedly fully read in or whatever else. Clearly, these people tend to have an agenda, and they, in the Trump era at least, are not shy about it at all.
So what does that tell us? We have this debate all the time about fake news and so forth, but how much can we actually trust the mainstream media when so many of them are invested in certain outcomes on various stories?
I mean, when it comes to something like the Covington Catholic kids, at least, I think we've all hopefully learned, those of us who really care about the facts. And I came out and said, look, these people aren't representative of the pro-life movement, which, if that first clip was true, is obviously the case. That's not how I want people who are representing the March for Life to be behaving. So I think we all have kind of learned an important lesson from this, which is wait 24 hours. And with stories about Russia too, Trump and Russia, we have to wait 24 hours and just kind of see what happens, because everyone's so quick to just jump to conclusions without seeing the full information, whether it's a viral news cycle or a particular piece of reporting. It's never a bad idea to just hit pause and contribute your commentary later once things have shaken out a little bit more.
Now, Alexandra, I'm guessing, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing you don't have a lot of MAGA hats in your closet. But
Not even one.
But it seems that even when the full evidence is coming out here, and it's at least a complicated story, if not a reversal of what a lot of people originally thought here, there's so many people on Twitter, and even some in the media, as you just mentioned, that because the kids are wearing the hats, they have to be the bad guy. That in and of itself is instigating something.
Oh, and there's so many. I've seen just these people, there's one person from Buzzfeed, for example, just other kind of the blue check mark crowd, I guess I'd call it, even though I have a blue check mark and don't see myself as being part of it. But there's kind of this left-leaning crowd of people saying things like, oh, look at, this is just another white man smirking and revealing his privileges they always have done. And, this is how we get people like Brett Kavanaugh who get away with sexual harassment or sexual assault, and just absolute wild extrapolations from, oftentimes feminists or just left-leaning people in general, trying to make this some big narrative about the patriarchy. And it just drives me absolutely crazy. Even if the initial video clip was true, that is still not what we're dealing with. But in the greater context, it's just absolutely ridiculous. It
is. And an exit question here. On the one hand, the unleashing of the online media, social media mob, where people are getting death threats now. Kids might get expelled, and people's livelihoods, their parents are getting harassed for their jobs and so forth. So on the one hand, the online social media mob is a mess. On the other hand, the fact that it exists means all these other videos got out there to get a fuller picture of the story. So what's the takeaway on what social media and all this stuff is doing to our culture?
I don't know. I think right now, at least for the most part, I feel like it's a pretty negative thing, just how quickly a mob can get ginned up like that, and there's sort of this group think that forms around it. But I do think there is obviously more power for the truth to reach people, at least who have the ears to hear it. So that's maybe a glimmer of hope in the broader dismal situation we're looking at.
Let's get more truth out there. Alexandra, let's look at the latest Planned Parenthood report. And you've reported on this. As usual, Planned Parenthood is saying that about 3% of its activities are abortion-related. But as you point out, in 4 different areas, a lot of the Planned Parenthood talking points are debunked by their own reports. Everything from the 3% number to Planned Parenthood's the only place that people can get care, and so on and so on. So what were the big reveals for you here?
Yeah, there are a couple of big takeaways. I mean, the biggest one is obviously Planned Parenthood has to report the number of abortions they performed last year, and they reported 332,757 abortions, which is the highest number they've reported since the 2011-2012 fiscal year. It's up 10,000 from last year. And you have to keep in mind, this number is rising. The number of abortions performed at Planned Parenthood is going up, even as the number of reported abortions nationwide has been going down every single year. And so if you look at, the statistics from the Centers for Disease Control, for example, Planned Parenthood performs more than half of the reported abortions in the United States. And based on the best estimates of nationwide, taking into account states that don't report their abortion statistics, Planned Parenthood makes up more than 1/3 of the entire abortion market. So this whole talking point that, we don't really do abortion, we're here for other sorts of healthcare, is not true. And this is something they say all the time. This is how they continue to get federal funding. And not only has their abortion provision gone up by a lot, but their other non-abortion services have gone down. So if you look at provision of contraception, if you look at cancer screenings, things like, other women's healthcare, like prenatal services, those have all gone down, while the only other thing that's gone up is STI, sexually transmitted infection tests and treatment have gone up. So for the most part, Planned Parenthood is not actually providing things that women can't get elsewhere. And this is obviously a really common talking point. They say, millions of women rely on us as their only form of healthcare. Well, first of all, you're providing very little in the way of actual healthcare. And second of all, there are thousands and thousands of actual healthcare clinics across the country that receive federal money too and don't do abortions that help women in ways that these few Planned Parenthoods, 600 in the country, just absolutely cannot.
You also bring up an interesting point here in that they get to this 3% level by saying that's the percent of services they provide. But as you explain, one patient can get a lot of different services, including an abortion. And so that really seems to spread out the percentage of abortions. But is there any clue as to what percentage of women they serve get an abortion?
Yeah, it would be somewhere around 14%, or at least, 14% of patients are there to get an abortion. If you calculate it a different way, they describe a service as a discrete clinical interaction, which allows them to inflate the number of things that they do. So if one woman walks into their clinic and gets 5 things, one of which is an abortion, suddenly we're down to 20% when she was there in the first place for the abortion, but in fact then went on to also have a cancer screening while she was there, a pregnancy test before getting the abortion procedure, and so on. But I think the crucial thing here is not, obviously, we have to point out that they're using, creating this 3% statistic to cover up the fact that they're the largest abortion provider in the United States by far. But on top of that, it's not really about a percentage. It's about the hard numbers. What are they doing in there? What kind of money are they getting? What kind of money are they spending? And clearly they exist to profit from abortion.
Alexandra, a quick follow-up. On a normal day without so much news, we'd probably devote a whole martini to this, but you were at the March for Life on Friday, and you also observed the Women's March here in Washington on Saturday. How would you compare and contrast?
I mean, it's really tough in terms of crowd size. It's really hard to get an estimate. They both looked very, enormous to me from what I could see being there and reporting. But the thing that really struck me and that I took away from it, hadn't really thought of it in quite this way before, despite having been to both before, is if you think about what these people are doing, if the people at the March for Life believe that, set aside what you think about abortion, they believe that there's a legal regime of mass killing of hundreds of thousands of human beings going on. And yet the people there are joyful, and they have signs about love and how they were adopted and how their mother chose life and whatever else. And at the Women's March, these are people who believe that they have, all sorts of legal rights, including the legal right to get rid of what they see as a clump of cells through all 9 months of pregnancy. And yet they're full of rage for the most part. And they have these vulgar, nasty signs attacking the president and attacking conservatives and whatever else. And I'm sure, a lot of women there probably are generally happy. I don't mean to put them all in a box, but there's this general just kind of atmosphere of absolute rage and frustration that you just don't see at all at the March for Life. And I think that's really telling.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, all right, let's move on to our last martini. And I guess I'm going to describe this one certainly as crazy. Jim and I had talked in the past couple of weeks, about senators like Mazie Hirono and Kamala Harris, wondering whether people affiliated with the Knights of Columbus, which is a Catholic lay organization, really ought to be considered for prominent positions like a federal judgeship. There's a Knights of Columbus member who is nominated by the president to be a federal district judge in the state of Nebraska. And so Hirono and Harris are very, very worried about this. And so they're wondering whether people like that need to renounce their membership or take other steps to basically not be so connected to the Catholic faith or other faiths that would probably describe themselves as pro-life. In the end, Ben Sasse didn't like this very much since he's from Nebraska. And here's what we hear from the Daily Caller. Ben Sasse introduced a resolution reaffirming the unconstitutionality of religious tests for public office. But Mazie Hirono once again went on the attack, accusing the mild-mannered Nebraskan of taking an alt-right position. Quote, "If my colleague, the junior senator from Nebraska, wants to embrace the alt-right's position by offering this resolution, that is his business," Hirono said on the Senate floor on Friday. "Rather than passing a resolution to address a problem that doesn't exist, we should focus on something real, like ending this totally unnecessary, unjustified shutdown." So this also goes back, I guess, to some extent, Alexandra, to the appellate court nomination of Amy Coney Barrett when Dianne Feinstein said that the dogma lives loudly within you. Amy Coney Barrett's not a member of the Knights of Columbus, but there's clearly a parallel here. And the Democrats don't seem to be all that worried about it, even though the Constitution is very clear there's no religious test.
I'm definitely not well briefed enough in the constitutional question here to say whether or not, what wording of these types of questions actually would constitute an unconstitutional religious test. But I think the general idea is, look, this is anti-Catholic bigotry. You people did this with Amy Coney Barrett, and I kind of see what they did recently with this district court nominee to be kind of a test run in possibly stopping the nomination, or the confirmation rather, of Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court if President Trump has another chance to nominate someone and picks her. I think these Democrats would do anything in their power to try and stop her. And I think they're sort of flexing their muscle on this, trying to see how much they can get away with in terms of criticizing someone's religion. And this is something you see a lot from the left, especially when it comes to abortion, just pinning people's pro-life views entirely on their religion and saying they're trying to use their religion to force other people to follow their idea of morality and whatever else. And so I think that's what we're seeing here. But this comeback from Senator Hirono that it's the alt-right's position. It's just one of the most insane things I've ever heard. And I have to ask, I mean, the resolution passed in the Senate by unanimous consent. So I don't really understand why she didn't stand up and say something then in protest and say there's no problem here. What I did wasn't wrong. She, I guess, went along with the resolution, then decided later she was going to come up with this just outrageous defense of herself. It doesn't make any sense.
Brian Bisher is the nominee for the federal court, and I think he's going to get through. But this almost kind of ties back in with both of our previous martinis, because you've got the Women's March with certain elements, obviously, that are anti-Semitic. Not much media pushback there. Not much media pushback with this situation. I think Tulsi Gabbard's the only one who's publicly on the left even suggested there's a problem with the increasing incendiary rhetoric towards Catholics in this situation. So once again, the media failing to do its job, because if it had gone on in the opposite direction, I think you and I both know how it would have gone.
Oh, of course. And it's absolutely disheartening. But I do think it's interesting if you actually look at the text of Ben Sass's resolution. He quotes JFK and what he said when he was running for president about how, today this anti-Catholic bigotry essentially might be directed at me, but it could be you tomorrow. And I think it's really helpful to go back and read that. And he was, of course, a Democrat and was not quite as Catholic as I would have liked, honestly. So I think it might be helpful for people on the other side to take a look at that and remember how serious what we're dealing with here really is.
It all basically boils down to what you think about abortion, right?
Yeah, I think at least when it comes to judicial nominees, unfortunately, that's what Roe has created.
Wow. Well, I'm sorry we had a really slow news day for you here, Alexandra, but thanks for coming in and subbing for Jim anyway. We'll actually talk to you a couple days next week. Look forward to it.
Me too. Thanks so much, Greg.
Alexandra DeSanctis of National Review in for Jim Garrity today. Jim will be back on Tuesday. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today, and tune in again Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.